Stand up. There you go. You were dreaming. What's your name? Well, not even last night's storm could wake you. I heard them say we've reached Morrowind. I'm sure they'll let us go.
A long time ago, I promised to make a video about why I thought Morrowind remained, to this day, the best game in the Elder Scrolls series. And I never did. Believe it or not, it wasn't because I was lazy, it was because the question is actually a difficult one to answer. There are many reasons and arguments from a technical and mechanical standpoint that are most commonly used by people to explain why they like Morrowind the most, and I will go over some of them, but more than this, Morrowind, like a lot of great games, and indeed great works of fiction in general actually, is so much more than the sum of its parts. It's an intangibly brilliant masterpiece, and for that reason, it's very, very difficult to sit down and deconstruct why exactly I have continually played, enjoyed, and appreciated this game above all others for more than 10 years now. When I first played Morrowind, it was a bewildering experience. I was thrust into a strange virtual world which I knew virtually nothing about. For more than a year, in fact, I was under the impression that the Telvanni wizard towers were where the Wood Elves lived. In my mind, it stood to reason, since they were essentially some kind of treehouse, and everything I'd learned about elves from other RPGs, books, and films told me that made sense. However, eventually, I realised that of course wasn't the case, and it was about that point that I truly began to realise how comprehensively well designed this little world actually was. It was unlike anything I'd seen before. A little simulated fantasy society lay before me on my big fat flickering CRT monitor, crafted with an almost insane level of attention to detail. Everything, from the method of fast travel to the shape of the door handles in Vivek City, served to paint a picture of the world around me, its society and its history. Morrowind is one of those games that every time you play it, you learn something new about the world in which it is set. I've completed the main quest of the game many times, and each time I've done so, even now, some new element of the plot that I'd missed previously comes to light, and changes my perspective on the situation. I won't go into further detail for fear of giving out spoilers, but suffice to say, what Morrowind managed to do more than its successors or predecessors was create a coherent universe that not only was a joy to explore from a gameplay perspective, but had an undeniable and distinguished sense of history to it. Slaying Alduin in Skyrim has never, for me, felt like the momentous occasion it should be. But I can tell you that the first time I journeyed under the Red Mountain and began my parley with the maddened demigod Dagoth-Ur, the first thing that struck me was the gravity of the situation. Here I was, about to write the closing chapter in a saga that had lasted for thousands of years, beginning long before my player character was even born. And the reason I even felt like this in the first place was because the game had succeeded in building, over the course of hundreds of hours, a world that seemed as real and tangible as my own. And that's saying something for a world in which giant mushrooms and living gods are considered a rather mundane fact of life. However, 10 years is a long time in gaming history. Since the halcyon days of Morrowind's initial release, we've seen 2 more Elder Scrolls titles come and go, and Bethesda have gone on to dip their toes into the world of Fallout as well, with varying degrees of success. Even now, talented designers and mod makers are working on Skywind, a project to recreate the world first presented in Morrowind in a form consistent with Bethesda's newer design philosophies. As a project in and of itself, it's astonishing just how much work has been done, and I'm continually impressed with each trailer they present to the public. Many people look forward to Skywind as simply being Morrowind in a better engine. Don't bother playing Morrowind now, they say. Just wait for Skywind. It'll be out soon. However, and I run the risk of sounding like a haughty, pretentious twat when I say this, I feel they are just missing the point somewhat. You're not getting in Skywind the old game in a new engine. Skywind is very determined to be its own product. Something new, something bearing the surface elements of Morrowind, but none of the original substance. That is something the creatives of Skywind are hoping to create themselves from scratch, and I wish them all the best in this ambitious project of theirs. However, what people need to understand is that what you're getting isn't Morrowind. It's a remake, a reboot even. In gaming circles, there is admittedly a lot of obsession with the notion of remakes. I've lost count of the number of times I've read comments to the effect of, "I wish they'd remake this game with modern graphics and a new combat system." The truth is that mainstream 3D graphics and, in some cases, specific game mechanics age very quickly in video games. A game that seemed state-of-the-art on release will, in as little as a year or two, seem clunky and obsolete. Graphics, when not in a particularly abstract style, age fast. But good gameplay never really does. The rift, therefore, between these two elements of game design gives rise to the constant wishes and calls for these remakes. And in some cases, what gamers ask for is exactly what they get. A version of the game built to run with more modern systems, in a higher resolution, and in some cases with some minor improvements to the graphical fidelity of the original. This is by definition the kind of thing that comes to mind when gamers think of a remake. But if the point hasn't been made clearly enough already, I'll reiterate. This kind of remake is not what Skywind is. Neither is this what Skywind is trying to be. Skywind is more like a movie remake. The core elements in terms of the plot and world remain the same, but while everything looks shinier and newer, it is most definitely the product of the design team or director in charge of the new film. I'm sure I don't need to start listing examples of what I'm talking about. You can probably think of one or two off the top of your head. And here's the kicker. The examples you're thinking of probably aren't very good ones. By which I mean the remakes weren't half as good as the original work. This seems to be a hallmark feature of a lot of movie remakes, and the term itself, remake, in film circles is often one that conjures negative connotations. The question to film buffs is often, why did we need a remake of this, rather than, why won't somebody remake this? The kind of remake I've already discussed within games does of course exist to some extent in movies. There are plenty of examples of HD, Blu-ray, remastered editions of old films, and more often than not they do look much better than their original incarnations. But as I've said, this isn't what Skywind is. The bottom line I'm trying to get to here is that I have this unfortunate feeling that Skywind is going to be, for me at least, the equivalent of one of these Hollywood remakes that often lacks the soul or somewhat miss the overall point of the original works on which they were based. Now, admittedly, you would be entirely justified in saying that I've no right to criticize Skywind, when it hasn't even been released to the public. That's true. I certainly haven't played it myself, and I probably won't for some time yet. However, based on what they've already told us, I can already get a good picture of what it might be like, and draw some conclusions from that. I'm already very familiar with Skyrim's engine, its limitations and its advantages. Elements of Morrowind, like the characters, plot, story, and to some extent the world in which it is set, are timeless and will translate well into any other engine you wish to transfer it to, but what you need to remember is that video games are not as simple and straightforward as books or films. Plot, story, characters, and writing are but a few small parts of the overall experience. Gameplay, good or bad, is something that is inevitably tied to the technology upon which it is built, and it is here that the problems for me begin to arise. When confronted with Morrowind as a modern gamer, there are a few things that stand out above all else. The combat system, primarily. This can't be overstated, in fact. It's often the chief complaint that newer gamers have when approaching Morrowind, and is often the reason they leave the game behind. Let's be honest, it's not what you'd call perfect. It's clunky, based entirely on random number generation, and frankly has more in common with the average tabletop RPG than anything conceived of, even in video games of its time, let alone video games of 2014. It's simply a product of its time and its development lineage. Many people do not in fact realise that the world of Tamriel itself was actually conceived as a setting in which the employees at Bethesda set their sessions of Dungeons and Dragons. Arena and Daggerfall both follow a very, very old-school system of dice-based RPG mechanics. Some of this remains in Morrowind, and Some of it has also become more complex and hidden away in the background to make it less obvious. For instance, the incredibly complex way in which a character's stats in Morrowind interact with each other is too advanced and relies too much on digital computations to ever really be committed to paper in a tabletop fashion in the way you could with Arena and Daggerfall. Something as simple as swinging a sword in Morrowind relies on so many variables. Yes, there is an initial random dice roll, of sorts, in the first place. However, beyond that, the result of this dice roll is affected by so many things. How much fatigue does the character have? How much fatigue does the target have? How much skill with this weapon does the character have? What is the character's strength? What is his agility? Does he have any spell-based bonuses to attack chance, or to any relevant skills or attributes? What about the enemy? What is his agility? What's his endurance? What's his armor level? What armor is he wearing? What skill does he have with that armor? How does that armor affect his attributes, and how do they in turn affect his armor level? Does he too have any buffs or debuffs to any skill, attribute, or percentage chance that affects any of these things I've already listed? Or does it affect something else which in turn has a knock-on effect on one of the many skills and attributes that are already in play? Furthermore, what type of attack is the player even making? A chop? A thrust? A slash? Does the weapon have enough reach to hit the target in the first place? How long did the player hold the attack button for? How powerful as a result is the swing going to be? I could go on, but I think you get the gist by now. All these things are going on with a simple swing of your weapon in Morrowind, let alone some of the more complex actions, tactics and strategies available to the player. While this system may seem archaic and clunky on the surface, it is in reality anything but. It's very advanced. By comparison, in Skyrim or Oblivion, all the game has to deal with is the prescribed damage of a weapon, the armor of the opponent, and whether or not the player's attack reaches the designated hitbox of the enemy in question. That's a bit of a hyperbolic simplification, but hopefully it demonstrates and underlines the point I'm trying to make, which is this. Morrowind's engine itself is a huge part of what made that game so great. It had something that gamers and designers alike call depth. The fact that all these many variables interact in such a complex way is what creates a more meaningful and gleefully creative gaming experience. In many ways, Morrowind doesn't simply have a combat system. What it has is a great big toolbox, with a myriad of parameters available for the player to tinker with in their quest to overcome the challenges put before them. You are free to be as creative or uncreative as you please. Create an enchanted sword that never misses. Make a dagger that when it hits renders the user invisible. Craft a ring that constantly restores a few points of health every second, allowing a character to regenerate their health on the spot. Make an amulet with a constant levitation effect, allowing you to fly indefinitely around the world. How about boots that can let you jump over tall buildings? The spell that both heals and damages an opponent at the same time, allowing you to practice your magical skills on a single opponent for as long as you wish, without him dying. The possibilities are almost endless, and the only limits are the stat system on which the game is based and your own imagination. And like I said, everything in Morrowind can interact with and have a knock-on effect on other things. Take for example an item like the Boots of Blinding Speed. They were a pair of magical boots which granted the player incredible running speed. However, as their name may suggest, the side effect was that it rendered the player completely blind. If this item were to appear in Skyrim, it would be a funny curiosity and little more. However, in Morrowind, with a bit of inventiveness on the part of the player, they could be transformed into something far more useful. By crafting an appropriate counterspell or enchanting another item to be worn at the same time, one could dispel this blinding effect from the boots and leave the positive speed buff intact. This is what I'm talking about when I say Morrowind has more depth. But of course, it doesn't end there. Much like the stats on which the game is based, this has a knock-on effect on the gameplay experience as a whole. To craft one of these wonderful items is no easy feat. A player needs a huge amount of skill with enchantment, or a fortune in gold to pay someone else to do it for them. One could even fashion a spell that would artificially inflate the player's enchanting ability to a high level. Doing so was neither easy nor cheap, but is yet another example of the kind of creative depth the game allowed the player. Aside from this, Retrieving the kind of soul gem and the kind of soul itself to put within it is a lengthy, world-spanning quest in its own right. Few such souls exist in the game at all, usually being reserved for only the most powerful beings in the game that the player can encounter. Creating an item using the soul of one of these unique beings therefore weaves a kind of narrative of its own. Imagine being the wielder of a sword powered by the soul of a fallen god. It sounds like some kind of pre-programmed unique artifact put in the game by the developers, but no. It's something you as a player can create yourself from scratch, if you have the patience, the skill, and the creativeness with which to complete such a task. Hell, if you've got a sense of humour, why not create a magical pair of slippers powered by the soul of a fallen god? It sounds daft, and it's probably because it is, but it's still an option open to the player if they wish it. Something to bear in mind perhaps for a SHEOGORAD-inspired character. I don't know. I'll leave that idea for you viewers to play with. One of the most defining features of the Elder Scrolls series is its determination to allow the player to do whatever they want. And none of the Elder Scrolls titles achieved this better than Morrowind, because the game engine itself allowed the player to not only go wherever they wanted, but to do almost anything they wanted. The player was all but actively encouraged to try and break, or at least bend, the laws of the universe as they saw fit to achieve their goals. A rather clever and almost subversive theme when you think about it, since the ability to mess with the universe is a rather important element of the game's main story in the first place. I won't elaborate more than that, for fear of spoiling the wonderful story Morrowind's main quest has to tell. However, all this is the reason that, after more than 10 years, I still play Morrowind. Quite aside from the fact that the game contains so much content condensed into such a relatively small world, this system of game mechanics upon which Morrowind is founded means that you never run out of things to do. For instance, some of these wonderful spells and items in any other RPG would merely quite often be the reward for a particular quest or something. And in Morrowind they still are. The only difference is that nobody made that quest for you. It was all your own doing. You were the one who sat there and thought, what if I could create a ring that gives me 100% chameleon as long as I'm wearing it? You were the one who decided what the best way to gather the items needed to create it was. You were the one who went and got them. You were the one who finally crafted and named the item for yourself. Congratulations, you're basically Sauron at this point, but it's not because there was some quest line that allowed you to do it. It was because you wanted to make it happen, and the game provided the tools with which you were able to accomplish this task. That's the thing about Morrowind. Even after all these years, the game... well, Morrowind feels like a playground, whereas Skyrim and Oblivion kind of just feel like a theme park, if you know what I mean. That kind of gameplay depth just never ages. To this day, there are hundreds of games released every year that don't even come close to the kind of freedom and player agency that Morrowind grants you. Yes, the game might look pretty dated these days, and yes, the world is a bit smaller than what we've come to expect from the likes of Skyrim, but these things are ultimately fairly trivial. In fact, in these days you can use mods to correct most of these issues. For instance, the fantastic Morrowind graphics and sounds overhaul, which, it must be said, does far more than simply improve sounds and graphics, is freely available and incredibly easy to install. Not only this, but a team of modders just as dedicated and talented as those working on Skywind have been creating more of the world we know and love in Morrowind to explore. Tamriel Rebuilt have been working since before the game was even released, and to this day, over a decade later, are still feverishly at work hoping to bring the rest of the province of Morrowind to life with all the attention to detail and core design philosophies with which Bethesda originally made Vvardenfell itself. I've played with this mod for years now, and I've yet really to scratch the surface, but what I can tell you is that it comes as polished and professionally crafted as any official expansion ever released by Bethesda themselves, in spite of being an order of magnitude greater in size than any DLC in the Elder Scrolls series to date. Tamriel Rebuilt is a topic really for another time, or another series of videos, some of which you can already find on my channel. But suffice to say, since they have already announced that they have no intention of trying to port their work to Skywind, it's yet another reason to give Morrowind a go, even now, at the back end of 2014, with Skywind still on the horizon. I have no doubt that Skywind will be an amazing project once it's finished and released to the public. However, I feel I will always end up coming back to the original Morrowind years after I've become bored with what Skywind has to offer, for the reasons I've already described in this video. The constant cries for someone to make Morrowind on a new engine are well justified, but I can't help but feel that putting Morrowind on a new engine in the first place would kill the magic that made the game so well loved to begin with. I love Skyrim. I've even come to enjoy Oblivion over the years for its own unique merits and charms. Both, however, I've found require a lot of modding work to actually provide an experience that is engrossing enough to capture my imagination and immerse me in their worlds long enough to keep me playing for years to come. Morrowind, with graphical improvements and community expansions aside, has never really required much in the way of mods to get the experience in an enjoyable state. That, I think, says a lot about its inherent quality, in spite of what many people have to say about that supposedly god-awful combat system. Yes, Morrowind is hard. It's hard to get into, it's hard to survive in early on. It's hard to climb to the top and reach the level of power many are familiar with from playing later games, but that's the inherent beauty. The game is a challenge. It does not hold the player's hand. It doesn't insult the player's intelligence. From everything from the quest design to the magic system, Morrowind is a game that relies on the player taking some responsibility for their own enjoyment, respecting your drive to press on and conquer this vast, wild, wonderful world in which you find yourself by any means you wish. In the same fashion of games like Dark Souls, it takes some time to crack that hard exterior, but once you do, you'll find one of the most rewarding video game experiences available in the 21st century. The world of Vvardenfell is your oyster, a carefully crafted and constructed landscape and society whose uniqueness stands out even in the realms of wider fantasy fiction. There's so much hidden away behind the surface for you to find that one could conceivably study a degree course on all that Morrowind's world has to offer. I've often heard the phrase continent in a box used to describe the Elder Scrolls games, and in no case is it more true than in Morrowind's. The Elder Scrolls III was, is, and shall always remain a weird, bizarre, engrossing, immersive, complex, beautiful, and clever masterpiece of game design, the likes of which, I'm sad to say, we will probably never see again. So if you've never played it before, now would certainly be the time. With a bit of help, Morrowind, for the most part, has, like a fine wine, matured with age. And even though the newer games in the series are more state-of-the-art with greater graphical fidelity, voice acting, and action-packed combat, they all lack that special something which has, for years, caused obsessive, crotchety old fans of the series to make daft little videos like this one. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you next time.
Yes, we've been expecting you. You'll have to be recorded before you're officially released. There are a few ways we can do this, and the choice is yours.